So Haimin Hu is the presenter.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. So my name is Haimin, and I'm from the University of Pennsylvania. So today I'm going to talk about our recent work on Polytopic Tube MPC using min-max differential inequalities. So this is joint work with my colleagues from Shanghai Tech, Xu Hui, Mario, and Boris. So this is the roadmap of my talk today. So first I will give you a brief introduction to the topic of robust MPC, and then I will jump into our contribution part, which is mainly on the polytopic tube MPC scheme. So now let's get started. So suppose we have a control system, for example, the aircraft here, and it has to reach some goal while avoiding some obstacles. So we will be controlling the system using MPC. That means we will formulate an optimization problem in which we will minimize the distance to the dotted line here. Let's say it is our reference trajectory, for example. And then our problem is also subject to our system dynamics as well as some state and input constraints. But what happens in real life is that we will have some external disturbances. For example, the wind disturbance here. And the most naive way to handle disturbance is to simply ignore it, which leads to the so-called certainty equivalent MPC. And here you would simply plug in 0 for disturbance in your system dynamics. And then you can do a prediction. And what happens in the online control is that you will apply your first control law and evolve your system forward. But because of the existence of the disturbance, your actual trajectory will be a little bit off your predicted ones. And so you will, then you will receive new measurement and do the same thing over and over again. But the problem here is that the certainty equivalent assumption is really too optimistic. That means that the disturbance might cause your optimization problem to be infeasible at the next times that you want to solve it. And maybe more seriously, your system might just violate your constraint, and so causing some safety issues. So this motivates us to design some MPC scheme with robustness guarantees. And ideally, we want to consider all possible perturbed trajectories that are perturbed by the disturbances. And we also would like to design some feedback policies to reduce the effect of the disturbances. And in fact, a practical way to do this is to using the so-called tube MPC scheme. So the main idea here is to enclose all those perturbed trajectories by a set valued tube. And then we will parameterize the tube using a fixed shape. For example, in this seminal work on robust MPC by May et al., they propose to synthesize the tube cross-sections offline. And in the online phase, we only optimize over the central path, and we also call this the nominal trajectories of our system. And by doing so, the computational complexity is almost the same as your standard MPC scheme. But the limitations here are also obvious. So the procedure they propose to synthesize the tube works easily only for linear systems. And by fixing the tube cross-sections, you will also be more conservative. So this motivates us to design a better and more general tube MPC scheme. And this paper by Villanova et al. Really gives us the opportunity to do that. And the major difference here is that now we are parameterizing the tube cross-sections with arbitrary shapes. And in the online optimization phase, we not only optimize the central path, but we are also optimizing the tubes. And by doing so, we will become less conservative. And more importantly, this is applicable to general nonlinear systems, of course, at the cost of being non-convex. So in the next, I will show you a little bit how this scheme works. So for simplicity, let's consider this kind of nonlinear systems with a fine input and a fine disturbance. And we assume that the disturbance lies within some bounded set. And we are also given a feedback control of mu. So now I need to define the notion of reachable set. So intuitively, we just start from some initial condition and say, let's roll out all possible perturbed trajectories that are affected by our disturbances. And those reachable set at time t just collects all those perturbed trajectories. So as long as we have this reachable set, we can immediately design some robust control scheme based on that. But unfortunately, this set can be any connected set and might be non-convex for general nonlinear systems. So it is not computable in general. So a more practical way is to do some convex outer approximations for your exact reachable set. For example, here we are bounding your original reachable set using an ellipsoid. So we just mentioned the idea of bounding one slices of reachable set at a specific point in time. But what we really care about is every slices of such reachable sets over your entire control horizon. So this leads to the idea of doing convex outer approximation for an entire reachable tube, using the notion of the so-called robust forward invariant tubes we call RFITs. And intuitively, you can just look at the bottom figure here. The black tube we call YT on the outside encloses your exact reachable set, which is marked in red here. So also in this paper, we can find sufficient conditions to construct such an RFIT to ensure safety for your system. And we assume that the tube cross-sections are parameterized by ellipsoids in this case. So as long as you have the RFITs, you can immediately design a robust tube-based MPC based on that. For example, in this prototype optimization problem, we will be optimizing the tubes online. And in the constraints, we will first constrain your function y to be an RFIT, and then force it to be in your feasible set x. And the resulting controller of this optimization problem will ensure a robust feasibility for your control system. And more importantly, it is computationally tractable and can be solved by gradient-based methods. And in our works that I'm going to show you soon, we will be pretty much following the same idea. But we will rather consider the tubes to be parameterized by polytops. And we will also be providing sufficient conditions to construct RFITs, which is parameterized by polytops. And we will also ensure those properties for our resulting controllers. So now let's get into our contribution part. So from now on, I will assume this type of uncertain linear systems. And then I will comment on how to extend this to general nonlinear systems. And we also assume that our input and disturbance sets are polytops as well. And as I mentioned, now the tube cross-sections are polytops. That means that the parameters of our tubes are basically those vertex points. And you can also call it the vertex matrices that are time-varying. So our goal is clear. We want to find a set-valued function y of t such that it is a valid RFIT for our uncertain linear system. So let me also give you a brief review of the basic polytopic geometry, because we will be using that to derive our theorems. So you know that a polytop is basically a convex cone of its vertex points. And a normal cone with respect to a given vertex point is intuitively marked in this yellow region here. It is basically a set collecting all of those C vectors, which is marked in red. And we also need a notion of support function that are defined for our polytop, which is given such vector C, and it is in the form of those maximization problem over a affine function. And the x here lies inside your polytop. And from basics of linear programming, we know that the maximum must be obtained at one of the vertex points, let's say yi. And let's call this optimizer I star. So in other way around, the C vector here must be within the normal cone of I star. And now let's start to rotate the C in the state space and see what happens. So as you might have noticed that as we change the direction of C in the state space, it simply goes through all of those normal cones that are defined for our polytop. So the important observation here is that the index set of the vertices perfectly partitions your state space. So the other way around, for any given C in your state space, you must be able to find a normal cone such that the C lies with E. So it is important to keep this in mind because we will be using this for deriving our series. So back to our control problem, we want to find conditions such that the y of t is a valid RFIT for our system. And fortunately, we have exactly the right tools to do that. So it is given also in this paper that if the set valued function y of t satisfies these conditions, then it is a valid RFIT for our system. So the good thing here is that this condition holds for arbitrary set valued function y of t. But as you might have noticed, we have both a differentiation on support function and a nasty min-max optimization problem here, so which makes it computationally intractable for the general case. So the idea here is to derive tractable conditions, of course, for our polytopic parameterization of the RFITs, and using some of the properties that we have just discovered for our polytops. So now we are ready to show you our first theorems in our paper. So it is basically a simplified version of the min-max differential inequalities for the polytops. And it is basically saying that a total number of n such min-max di's has to be held in order for our y of t to be an RFIT. And the good thing here is that instead of the differentiation on the support function, as I showed you in the previous slide, now we have differentiation on this vector value function y of t. So we are making progress. And let me also show you a brief sketch of the proof and see how we arrive at this. So we simply start from this general case min-max di's and then plug in our parameterizations of the polytop. And then we did another rewrite of the definitions by simply plugging in the definitions of the support function that are defined for the polytops. So we have an additional inner max problem here. And notice that now we need this condition to be held for all C's in the state space. And in the next, I will use a trick to reduce this condition, which is basically using the observation that we have just discovered. The index set of the vertices partitions the state space. So rather than searching C over the entire state space, we can simply enumerate the vertex sets. So now we can only need this condition to be held for each vertices. And we have this additional constraint saying that the C must be within the associated normal cone. So because of these additional constraints on C, we can simply reduce this inner max problem to the associated vertex point. And you can see that this is exactly the same as what we have in the lemma, and this completes the proof. But unfortunately, this lemma is still involving nasty min-max differential inequalities. So we need some additional efforts to convert it into something that we can use directly in our control problem. So this naturally leads to theorem 2 in our paper, which we further reduce the condition to construct the RFIT to a set of ordinary differential equations. And you can take a closer look at each individual ODEs in which we are enumerating those vertex points of the disturbance sets as well. So in this way, we have n times nw ODEs that has to be satisfied in order for our y of t to be an RFIT. And also in this last term in the ODE here, we have some additional degrees of freedom, which we call multipliers, lambda i's, that later on will be our decision variables. So I will omit the proof here, but it is based on the dual form of linear programming. If you are interested, you can check it out in our paper. So the important thing here is that we have, in order to construct such a RFIT, we only need those ODEs to be satisfied. And those can be directly incorporated into our control problem. So remember that the general form tube MPC looks like this. And now we simply plug in those conditions that we have just derived for the polytopic case. So you can notice that in this optimization problem, our decision variables are those vertex points y, the controller u, and also those multipliers lambda. And in the constraints, first, of course, we have those ODEs to ensure the validness of our RFITs. And then we have those standard input and the state constraints. So in terms of the online control, we can simply choose the controllers to be the controller associated to any of your vertex points. And by applying this controller in the standard MPC form, which means that you apply the first control input to your system and do replanning, your system will be robustly feasible. And importantly, you can notice that this is in the standard optimal control problem form. And you can use your favorite discretization method for the dynamics here. And then the problem will be computationally tractable and can be solved by gradient-based methods. So let me finally show you one of our numerical results. We considered a simple double integrator dynamics, and we have a state constraint on the first state, and we parameterize our tube using a polytop with 4 vertices. And here on the left-hand side, you can see the closed loop trajectory, which is the black dashed line using certainty equivalent MPC, which basically ignores your disturbance. And you can see that the disturbance simply drives the system to be infeasible at this point. And on the right-hand side, I plotted a couple of those blue trajectories, which are basically under your different uncertainty realizations. And you can notice that with the help of the tube, those perturbed trajectories never violates the constraints. And finally, they also reaches the origin. So as a short summary, we have just derived sufficient conditions to construct RFITs that are parameterized by polytops. And we also provide a tube MPC scheme based on that, which is in standard optimal control problem form. So it is computationally tractable and ensures constraint satisfaction for a closed loop system. And for future works, we also want to characterize the inner approximations of your original reachable set. And by comparing those outer and inner approximations, we can quantitatively know how conservative we are. And we also want to extend our procedure to general nonlinear systems and do some real-time implementations. And as for the last 2 points, we already have some preliminary works that are derived for the ellipsoidal case. So we believe that they will also be fairly easy to do so also for the polytopic case. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. So how does this proposed framework work for high-dimensional systems? Because in your formulation, you need to define, like, based on the subscripts of I, that is vertices, right? So for high-dimensional systems, you probably have, like, thousands of vertices.
Yes, it will go a lot. Yeah. So you need to find some heuristics to reduce the computational complexity for this kind of schemes. But the number of vertices that you can choose to parameterize your tube is a design parameter. So you can, for example, choose this number to be fairly small to try to reduce your computational complexity. And this is all I can say.
You said you optimize the tube cross-section. So do you also optimize the direction of the cross-section, or do you have fixed base direction for the cross-sections?
So what do you mean by direction? You mean,
Like,
for example, yeah. So the tube, the shape of the tube is determined by those vertices. So actually, the orientation of the cross sections depends on where is your vertices.
Yeah, say something about that. So the orientation, for example, if you have, instead of using this approach, if you use an ellipsoidal approach, then the orientation plays a role. I mean, you need also to search, not just for an ellipsoid, but you need, it's important to know, how is the ellipsoid, what is the orientation.
Sure.
So yeah, for this work, I think, yeah, you're right. Maybe the orientation is determined by the vertices.
Yeah. Actually, this approach might be more flexible than the ellipsoidal approach.
Yeah, this is what I want to say, because you said about the ellipsoid. So the problem with ellipsoids is that you need also to determine the orientation.
Sure.
Because perhaps your tube is not like that, it's like that.
Yeah.
Even it's the same size of ellipsoid, what it matters is the orientation.
And the ellipsoid is symmetric, and in this case, this tube is not necessarily
Yeah, this is another thing.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
This is
So you use outer coverings of the reachable tube, right?
Yes.
And so which means that there are parts which is not reachable. So I'm just wondering, how does it guarantee the contents as such?
So
Because in natural sense there are parts which is not reachable. It's an outer covering, right?
So if you do this outer approximation, it simply covers more disturbance, covers more of the disturbance sets instead of your space. So it is the other way around.
So it is.
So do outer approximation of your original reachable tube, you can counter for more disturbance than you would expect it to be, not the other way around.
Okay, so from my understanding,
Yeah.
if it's an outer covering, then it is not actually reachable. Like there are parts which
Yeah.
are reachable. It's an outer covering, right?
Yeah, it is sometimes confusing, but when you just write down the definitions, you will find that it is actually the other way around.
Yeah.
It's-
Any other questions? No? Let's thank again the speaker. Yeah, this presentation concludes also the session, so thanks for attending and hope this was some very good presentation. Yeah. And now there's, I think, break for coffee.